This is a piece of fiction that was written for amusement. Please let us know where you're watching from in the comments section before we start our inquiry. The impact these stories can have is always amazing. In my decades of investigating unique property limitations across the northeastern United States, I found many peculiar provisions buried in deed transfers, easements that served no apparent function, covenants that seemed to benefit no one. However, nothing could have prepared me for what I found in the country. Records of Saratoga County, New York. Since 1913, a Victorian home on North Broadway had been subject to the same restriction with each change of ownership. The second-floor master bedroom was never to be used. No reason provided, no sunset clause, just that single, absolute prohibition that had survived for almost 50 years. Saratoga Springs holds a special place in the history and geography of New York. The community, which is about 30 miles north of Albany, changed from a frontier settlement to a fashionable resort destination. Rich tourists came in search of the supposed healing properties of the mineral springs that sprang up all over the place. During the 1880s, an architectural boom fueled by this cash inflow resulted in the construction of ornate Victorian homes along streets like North Broadway, where prosperous professionals and businessmen constructed impressive homes. Archibald Brennan, a wholesale grain merchant, built the home under inquiry in 1889. He had constructed his business that runs warehouses in Albany, Troy, and Skankstady and supplies flour and feed all around the capital region. He commissioned a 3-story home with a mansard roof, intricate iron cresting, projecting central pavilion, tall windows with elaborate surrounds, and ornamental slate tiles in the style of the Second Empire. Taking up the entire front portion of the second floor, the master bedroom was roughly 21 by 18 feet and included 3 big windows that faced North Broadway, providing a commanding view of Congress Park across the street. To refresh your memory, this narrative is being listened to on the channel The Fear Behind You. Please be advised that this video has been duplicated and uploaded without my permission if you are hearing it from any other channel. If so, I respectfully request that you report it. We appreciate your support of original material. Archibald lived in the house with his wife Lenora, who hailed from a banking family in Troy. Astrid Halverson, a Norwegian immigrant who worked for them as a housekeeper, had worked in numerous famous Saratoga houses before joining the Brennan residence. This household composition did not change between 1889 and the winter of 1912, according to city directory documents from the Public Library's Saratoga room. What initially grabbed my eye to this property wasn't the deed limitation itself. Throughout my research work, I came across thousands of odd property clauses. What made this case different was a mention I noticed in the correspondence archives of a regional architectural historian who had studied Victorian residences in Saratoga Springs throughout the 1950s. This was one of the observations he made regarding the North Broadway residence. Despite several heating system upgrades, the current owner claims ongoing temperature irregularities in the main bedroom. Restriction on room usage dates to 1913. The original explanation is not listed in the records that are currently accessible. This prompted me to look for more thorough documentation regarding the property's past. I found that Archibald Brennan, like numerous prosperous businesses of his generation, maintained thorough ledgers. These weren't only financial documents, but detailed journals documenting both corporate transactions and personal observations. The Brennan family documents donated to the New York State Library in 1961 by a distant cousin settling an estate contained ledgers extending from 1875 to 1912. The 18,891,911 entries show a prosperous and well-organized life. Archibald kept track of Astrid's salary, the price of coal delivery, renovations to the carriage house, social engagements attended, commercial contracts negotiated. The pattern persisted for 22 years. Careful documentation of a successful life proceeding according to plan. This pattern is broken by the entries from February 1912. In the margin of a business ledger on February 4th, Archibald wrote, "I mentioned this morning that the master chamber has become uncomfortable for me, was unable to describe the precise type of discomfort. Assured her I would have the room checked for drafts or wetness." 3 days later, the master chamber was thoroughly inspected by Johansson, the builder. He discovered no building flaws and no problems with the walls or windows. The room seems to be absolutely sound. By the end of February, the entries had become more regular and more troublesome. L says she cannot explain why she dislikes the master chamber, simply that staying there causes her more and more distress. She has transferred her possessions to the Rose guest room, have not demanded that she come back as her. Discomfort appears genuine. Archibald himself left the room in March. What strikes me about these entries is Archibald's obvious dissatisfaction with his master chamber. After 5 consecutive nights of poor sleep in the master chamber, have relocated to the green guest room adjacent to Lee's room. The decision feels irrational, as I can identify no specific problem with the chamber itself. Yet, the unease I experience when attempting to sleep there has become intolerable. Incapacity to find a rational cause. Here was a man who had developed a commercial empire by thorough study and realistic problem solutions. Confronted with a circumstance that went against his systematic strategy. Archibald's ledgers show his methodical attempts to find a solution during the spring of 1912. He had a physician evaluate both himself and Lenora for nervous issues. The physician detected nothing wrong and said the issue might be due to stress from business issues. Archibald was aware that this was not the instance. He had a heating specialist check the entire system and make improvements to improve a temperature regulation in the master chamber. The specialist did the work, but it caused no change in how the room felt. Archibald recorded something on April 19th that shows how deeply concerned he was. Have become more reluctant to pass the master room. The door remains closed. I must, however, rush by it. This is ridiculous, but the urge still exists. L has mentioned she experiences the same. Desire to stay away from that end of the corridor. Archibald sought advice from a coworker with property management expertise in May. He mentioned that he had experienced similar circumstances in other buildings, and that if the discomfort continues, I should think about keeping the room closed. His ledger entry from May 7th reads, "I spoke with Harrison today regarding the master chamber issue. He suggested that some properties simply have rooms that prove unsuitable for occupation, though he could not explain why, and unused rather than continuing to struggle with it." By June, both Archibald and Lenora had completely avoided the second-floor hallway near the master bedroom. They used the back stairs exclusively and had Astrid rearranged the household routine to minimize anyone's need to pass by that area. On July 3rd, Archibald made a decision that would affect the property for decades. Have consulted with my attorney, Ephraim Townsend, regarding a legal matter concerning the house, explained the situation with the master. The Brennans put the house up for sale in September 1912, and according to property records at the Saratoga County Clerk's office, the listing remained active for 7 months without drawing in a suitable buyer. He listened without interruption, then suggested that if we decide to sell the property, we might include a restrictive covenant regarding that room. He said such provisions are unusual, but not unprecedented. I am giving this serious consideration. The covenant about the master bedroom to the deed and reduce the asking price by 25%. The house sold within 3 weeks. The purchasers were a retired attorney named Gideon Whitmore and his wife Millicent. Gideon had practiced law in Albany for 30 years before retiring to Saratoga Springs. In a letter to a former law partner preserved in the Albany Law School archives, Gideon wrote, "Have purchased an excellent property on North Broadway at a most favorable price." The seller included an unusual limitation about one of the bedrooms, but there are 7 other bedrooms in the property, so this is not a practical problem. The price reduction more than compensates for any inconvenience. Gideon Whitmore maintained a correspondence practice even in retirement, and his letters provide glimpses into his experience with the North Broadway house. In November 1913, he wrote to a colleague, "You inquired about our new residence. It suits us admirably, though I must confess the previous owner's insistence on that. Bedroom restriction no longer seems quite so eccentric. There is something about that area of the house that I find difficult to articulate. Not frightening precisely, but distinctly uncomfortable." The following year, Gideon's observations became more detailed. In a letter dated May 1914, he wrote, "I have spent some time attempting to understand the nature of the discomfort associated with the closed room. Being a man with legal training, I am accustomed to evaluating situations systematically. However, this scenario defies analysis. The room itself, on the few occasions I have entered it, appears perfectly ordinary. Standard construction, ample light, proper ventilation. Nevertheless, remaining in that environment causes a building sense of worry that worsens with each passing minute." In August 1914, Gideon made an observation that would be reiterated by future owners. "I have noticed that Millicent and I have both unconsciously changed our motions through the home to avoid passing the closed door. We utilize the back staircase, despite it being less convenient. Our private quarters have been relocated to the other end of the second level. These adjustments came gradually without any debate, as though we both independently realized that distance from that room was preferable." The Whitmores stayed at the house until 1921. Periodically throughout those 8 years, Gideon mentioned the locked room in his letters, but always with a sense of perplexity rather than alarm. He remained academically fascinated about the phenomenon, but never found an explanation that satisfied him. When the Whitmores sold the property in 1921, the deed limitation moved unchanged to the new owners. Dr. Cornelius Ashwood, a widowed doctor, and his sister Prudence, who worked as his maid and manager, were the buyers. Dr. Ashwood had recently retired from a long career in general practice and had chosen Saratoga Springs for his retirement years. Personal writings and medical case notes of Dr. Ashwood are kept at the New York Academy of Medicine, provide the most scientifically thorough analysis of the master bedroom phenomenon. Unlike past owners who regarded the matter as a puzzling inconvenience, Dr. Ashwood saw it as a problem to be investigated using medical and scientific concepts. His diary entry dated April 1921, 1 month after moving into the mansion, states, "Have commenced systematic study of the closed room on the second floor. As a physician trained in empirical observation, I am resolved to identify." Dr. Ashwood conducted what he called exposure experiments on himself over the next few months, spending measured periods of time in the master bedroom recording his physical and psychological responses. His notes from these experiments are remarkably detailed. The initial examination shows no obvious environmental factors, including temperature at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity normal for the season, no unusual odors, and adequate ventilation through functional windows. Exposure trial number 7 entered room at 2 p.m. Remained for 40 minutes. Physical observations: heart rate elevated from resting 68 beats per minute to 89 beats per minute within first 10 minutes, remained elevated throughout. Respiration rate increased from 14 to 19 breaths per minute. Hands became cold despite warm ambient temperature. Subjective experience: mounting anxiety without identifiable cause, sensation of being observed despite confirmed solitude, strong compulsion to exit the space. Symptoms resolved within 5 minutes of leaving the room. Dr. Ashford's experiments continued through the summer of 1921. He tested different times of day, different weather conditions, different durations of exposure. The results remained consistent. Entering the room produced measurable physiological stress responses that could not be attributed to any identifiable environmental factor. In September 1921, Dr. Ashford wrote a lengthy analysis in his journal. After 6 months of systematic observation, I must conclude that whatever produces the psychological and physiological responses associated with the master chamber is not detectable through standard medical or environmental assessment. I have measured temperature, humidity, air pressure, light levels, and sound. All fall within normal ranges. Yet, the human response to the space is unmistakable and consistent. This suggests we are encountering a phenomenon that our current scientific understanding cannot adequately explain. Dr. Ashford consulted with colleagues in psychiatry, neurology, and environmental medicine. None could offer an explanation that accounted for the consistent answers he documented. In a letter to a psychiatric colleague in November 1921, he stated, "What worries me most is not the existence of the phenomenon, but our inability to measure its cause. We can document the consequences with precision, yet the stimulus remains undetectable to our instruments." By 1922, Dr. Ashford had abandoned his investigation. His journal entry from March of that year states, "Have concluded that continued study of the master chamber provides no practical purpose. It's a true phenomena. The effects are measurable, but the cause remains beyond our capacity to pinpoint. Like the previous owners, Prudence and I have learned to live with the restriction." The deed limitation was transferred once more when Dr. Ashford and his sister sold the house in 1928. Horace and Beatrice Cunningham, a couple in their late 40s, were the buyers, Horace having amassed his fortune. It appears that certain mysteries defy scientific explanation. In textile manufacturing, and was semi-retired. They employed a live-in housekeeper named Dagmar Olsen, a Danish immigrant who had worked in domestic service since arriving in America in 1905. Dagmar kept a personal journal written in a mixture of English and Danish. After her death in 1956, a colleague who had worked alongside her in various households donated the journals to the Saratoga Springs History Museum, along with a translated typescript. The journal provides a domestic servant's perspective on the house. In her first note about the North Broadway residence, dated October 1928, Dagmar wrote, "The new household is comfortable. The house is large yet well kept." Mrs. Cunningham said, "On the second floor, there is a chamber that is locked and cannot be cleaned or entered. In my years of employment, I have witnessed wilder arrangements." By January 1929, Dagmar's tone had changed. "I don't like the hallway on the second floor by the locked door. The air feels heavier. There, though I know this sounds foolish. I complete my work in that area as quickly as possible and retreat to other parts of the house." Have not mentioned this to Mrs. Cunningham. In May 1929, Dagmar made a more detailed observation. Mrs. Cunningham asked me today if I had noticed anything unusual about the area near the locked room. I admitted I find it uncomfortable and tend to hurry through my work there. She seemed relieved by my answer. She told me that she and Mr. Cunningham experienced the same discomfort as did all the previous owners she has spoken with. She said there is something wrong with that room, though no one can say what. I believe her. The Cunninghams sold the house in 1934 during the depths of the Depression. The property market had collapsed, and they were fortunate to find a buyer at any price. The deed restriction transferred to the new owner. Between 1934 and 1948, the house changed hands 6 times. Each ownership period lasted between 2 and 4 years. I was able to locate minimal. In 1948, the house was bought by a civil engineer named Roland Prescott, who had just returned from wartime service in the Army Corps of Engineers. Roland had studied structural engineering prior to the war and approached problems with mathematical precision. Roland kept detailed notebooks about projects that were completed, but the pattern of rapid turnover, declining prices, and the persistent deed restriction that accompanied every transfer was evident in the property records themselves. He was fascinated by the North Broadway house, and his notebooks from 1948 and 1949, which I was able to access through a professional colleague who had collaborated with him on municipal projects, contain copious documentation of his attempts to comprehend the master bedroom. He started by making exact architectural drawings of the room, measuring every dimension to within 1/16 of an inch. He examined the room's proportions, comparing them to other rooms in the house and to architectural treatises on. He looked at the room's structural elements after discovering harmonious spatial relationships. In a November 1948 notebook entry, he noted, "Have exposed section of wall in master bedroom to examine framing and construction. Wall studs are standard dimension lumber spaced 16 inches on center, consistent with construction practices of 1889. Plaster is put on hardwood lath, also standard for the period. No anomalies found, no hidden areas or odd materials. Construction is essentially conventional." Roland's work grew to incorporate auditory analysis. He utilized tuning forks and his own trained ear to test how sound behaved in the room compared to other areas in the house. "Room has normal acoustic qualities," he noted in January 1949. "No strange resonances or dead patches. Wood floors and plastered walls both absorb and reflect sound." Despite discovering nothing abnormal in the room's physical design, Roland had the identical psychological effects that prior owners have reported. His notebook entry from March 1949 is telling, "Have spent 3 hours in the master bedroom today, determined to overcome the irrational discomfort I feel in that space. Documented my physical responses: elevated heart rate, increased perspiration, mounting sense of unease. Yet, every measurement of the room itself reveals ordinary construction. The disconnect between subjective experience and objective measurement is profound and troubling." By June 1949, Roland had reached the same conclusion as Dr. Ashford years before. The phenomenon was real but unexplainable within current understanding. He added, "As an engineer, I am trained to detect problems and find solutions. I have failed to accomplish either in this circumstance. There is an issue. The cause is still unknown, but the effects can be replicated. This is a restriction in the context of understanding I bring to the subject, not in the instruments I have at my disposal." Roland sold the house in 1950 and moved to Buffalo, where he worked on bridge design projects for the New York State Department of Transportation. Some structures harbor qualities that resist engineering analysis. This house has taught me the limits of my profession's ability to explain all aspects of built space. An uncomfortable, but perhaps valuable, lesson, he writes in his final notebook entry about the North Broadway house. The house changed hands twice more in the 1950s, both times with the deed restriction intact and the sale price declining relative to comparable properties in the neighborhood. By this point, the North Broadway house had developed a reputation among local real estate professionals. A memorandum from 1957 written by a real estate broker to his associates and preserved in the business records of a defunct Really company, states, North Broadway Victorian solid construction. Good location, but carries restriction regarding second-floor or bedroom property, has extensive ownership turnover. History, recommend pricing 30% below market for comparable. Unrestricted properties disclose restrictions early in showing process to avoid wasting time with buyers who will reject after learning of it. In 1959, the house was purchased by a professor of psychology from Skidmore College named Dr. Helena Ashworth. She bought the property specifically because of its unusual history, seeing it as an opportunity to study environmental psychology in a real-world setting. Dr. Ashworth's research papers archived in the Skidmore College Library include several studies based on the North Broadway house. She detailed her rigorous controlled experiments with volunteer subjects in a 1960 paper titled Spatial Perception and Psychological Response, a case study. The subjects were brought to the house without being informed of its history, and they were asked to spend time in different rooms and rate their level of comfort in each one. The master bedroom consistently received the lowest comfort ratings, even from subjects who were unaware of the history of the room or the limitation on its employment. According to Dr. Ashworth, this specific architectural space consistently elicits negative responses that are statistically significant and cannot be attributed to suggestion or prior knowledge. Subjects report higher anxiety, discomfort, and want to leave the space. Regardless of the subject's personality type, cultural background, or conviction that the environment affects mood, these reactions take place. This suggests that objective element of the environment itself triggers the response. However, all quantifiable environmental factors are within normal bounds. Despite her professional curiosity in the issue, Dr. Ashworth found living in the house increasingly challenging. My research confirms what previous owners experienced, but confirming the phenomenon does not make living with it any easier, she wrote in a private letter to a colleague in 1962. The knowledge that a room in my own home produces consistent psychological distress in everyone who enters it has become more disturbing than intellectually interesting. I find myself avoiding that entire section of the second floor, and this avoidance affects how I move through my own home. Dr. Ashworth sold the house in 1963 and purchased a modern ranch-style home on the outskirts of Saratoga Springs. Her final paper on the subject, published in a regional psychology journal in 1964, concluded, after 4 years of systematic study, I cannot explain why this architectural space produces the documented psychological effects. The phenomenon is real and reproducible, yet it lacks any identifiable physical correlate. This case suggests significant gaps in our understanding of how humans interact with built environments. Some spaces, it appears, affect us in ways that transcend our current ability to measure or explain. Lelson, in 1965, a property development company, purchased the house with plans to convert it into apartments. The conversion plans filed with the Saratoga Springs Planning Department show the second floor was. When I interviewed Vincent Holbrook, the project manager who oversaw the 1968 conversion, he was straightforward when I asked him why the master bedroom was not included in the residential conversion. We knew the room's history, he said, adding that everyone in the local real estate industry was aware of it. The space that had been the master bedroom was repurposed into 3 residential units, but it was designated as a mechanical room. The first tenant lasted 6 weeks before requesting to break the lease, claiming that the room made her uncomfortable and that she couldn't sleep if she spent time in it. The second tenant stayed for 2 months, citing the same issue. We then sealed it off and designated it as mechanical space, which resulted in a loss of rentable square footage, but was preferable to constant turnover. We had assumed that modern tenants wouldn't care about outdated restrictions, but we were mistaken. I tried multiple times to get into the sealed master bedroom, but Holbrook refused. We don't open designated mechanical spaces for non-essential purposes. This creates liability issues if anything goes wrong during or after the inspection. I also sent a formal written request to the legal department of the property management company and contacted the Saratoga Springs Historical Preservation Commission to see if they could step in based on historical documentation. In my last attempt in early 1969, I found 3 people who had been inside the master bedroom after it was sealed off during the apartment conversion, but before the wall was permanently closed. One was a building inspector who had needed to confirm the electrical work. Another was a plumber who had run water lines through the adjacent wall, and the third was a plasterer who had sealed up the doorway. I even offered to cover any costs involved in opening and resealing the space, but all requests were turned down. The building inspector, a man named Morris Weinstein who was near retirement, remembered the experience clearly. "Strangest inspection I ever did," he told me. "Room looked completely normal. Good wiring, no code violations, standard construction throughout. But I couldn't wait to finish and get out of there. Made me feel like something bad was about to happen, though I couldn't tell you what." I've been in thousands of rooms over my career. Never felt anything like that before or since. The plasterer was the most reluctant to talk about it. "I don't like talking about that job." "Huh?" He said nothing happened, understand? Nothing I could recall. The work wasn't difficult, just running some copper lines through the wall cavity, but that room gave me the creeps. I'm not superstitious, never have been, but I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time I was in there like someone was watching me. Can point to and say that was wrong. But the feeling in that room, like the air was heavier, like my chest was being compressed. I've done plaster work in some rough places, old buildings with real problems. This wasn't like that. This was something else. I finished the job because I'm a professional, but I was relieved when that doorway was sealed up. None of these tradesmen could articulate what specifically caused their discomfort. They described sensations, psychological responses, physical reactions, but when pressed for objective details about the room itself, they had nothing unusual to report. It was a room. It had walls, a floor, a ceiling, windows. Everything appeared normal, except for how it affected the people inside it. The house still stands on North Broadway, operating as an apartment building, as it has for more than a decade. The former master bedroom remains sealed behind a plastered wall marked on no floor plan accessible to tenants mentioned in no rental agreement. Current residents of the building, according to property manager Vincent Holbrook when I last spoke with him in 1969, have no knowledge of its existence. The deed restriction that Archibald Brennan imposed in 1913 technically remains in effect, though it has become moot. The room cannot be occupied because it no longer legally exists as habitable space. It is simply void, a sealed box within the structure of the building, serving no purpose except to remain closed. I have spent 5 years investigating this case, examining every available document, interviewing every surviving witness I could locate, consulting with experts in architecture, psychology, engineering, and medicine. I have traced the property's history through 56 years and 11 ownership changes. I have documented consistent patterns of psychological response across dozens of individuals from different backgrounds, different eras, different circumstances, and I am no closer to understanding what makes that room different from any other room in any other house. What I can document with certainty is the pattern of human response. Every person who spent significant time in that space reported similar experiences. Mounting anxiety without identifiable cause, sensation of being observed, elevated heart rate and respiration, overwhelming compulsion to leave. These responses occurred regardless of whether people knew the room's history. They occurred in subjects of Dr. Ashworth's controlled experiments who had never heard of the restriction. They occurred in tradesmen who entered the room solely to perform professional work. Dr. Ashford's medical. Observations confirmed the physiological reality of these responses. Roland Prescott's engineering analysis confirmed no structural anomaly could account for them. Dr. Ashworth's psychological research confirmed the responses were statistically significant and reproducible. Yet, none of this investigation identified a cause. The master bedroom has now been sealed for 19 years. Before that, it was locked and unused for 52 years. For 7 decades, one room in a functioning building has been rendered unusable, not because it is structurally unowned or environmentally hazardous, but because it produces an inexplicable effect on human psychology. Multiple owners attempted to understand and resolve the situation. Archibald Brennan applied practical problem solving. Gideon Whitmore brought legal analysis. Dr. Ashford employed medical and scientific methodology. Roland Prescott used engineering principles. Dr. Ashworth applied psychological research. All failed to identify an explanation that accounted for the observed phenomena. The restriction that Archibald Brennan imposed has now persisted for 56 years. It has outlasted everyone involved in its creation. It has survived economic depressions, wars, social changes, and the transformation of the property from single-family home to apartment building. It persists not because of tradition or superstition, but because everyone who encountered that room independently reached the same conclusion. It should not be used. I have no explanation for this phenomenon. I can only document what occurred. The sealed master bedroom on North Broadway is one example of a case that, in my experience as a researcher, is the most unsettling because it is located in a converted Victorian that is occupied by people who are unaware of its existence and serves no purpose other than to remain undisturbed. It has been owned by several generations, all of whom have reported consistent experiences and have come to the same practical conclusion. The room should remain closed. Rational response to something we cannot explain. Not to solve it, but to acknowledge our limitations and accept that some spaces simply should not be occupied. Archibald Brennan reached that conclusion in 1912. Every subsequent owner who investigated the matter reached the same conclusion. The room is now sealed, and it will likely remain so as long as the building stands. Some questions have no answers. Some phenomena resist investigation regardless of how systematic or scientific our approach. The Master.